Hey there guys, so I previously took a look at the Beelink Mini S13 and that's rocking the Intel N150 processor. And at $170, this is one of those tiers of mini PCs that are extremely popular. The N series of mini PCs have pretty much been dominating the sales on Amazon for the last 2 years. And it makes sense, they hit a price point where there's not really all that much competition. The only competition is different models of mini PCs that have the same chips in them. Sometimes there will be some minor configuration differences depending on the OEM that made them, but for the most part they all perform roughly the same. But one tier above that is around the $200 to $300 price range, and in here is where there's some pretty interesting options. And one of the most interesting ones is this BOSGAME mini PC. This right here is the BOSGAME P5. We've taken a look at this mini PC before, and currently on Amazon you can find it for $270. So there is a $100 price difference between these two systems. In terms of the configuration though, there are some key differences. For one, the Beelink here ends up coming in at 16 gigabytes of RAM, and that is single channel DDR4 memory. So running at 3200 mega transfers, but again, no dual channel, so your bandwidth is pretty limited there. That is of course also paired with the 4 cores and 4 threads of the N150, and it has a 512 gigabyte SSD. In general, for what it is, it's a pretty decent system, but 4 cores, 4 threads can be pretty limiting in 2025. The P5 here is rocking a Ryzen 5 6600H, so that is a 6-core, 12-thread CPU, and that is based off of Zen 3 Plus, and it has 24 gigabytes of RAM, and that is in dual channel, and it's not exactly the fastest DDR5 available today, but it is one of the first generation of DDR5 CPUs, so it's essentially running at the slowest speeds of DDR5. But since it is dual channel, it's going to have more memory bandwidth than the Beelink here. And of course, since it is 24 gigabytes of RAM, you also see a bump in capacity there, and well, it's still a 512 gigabyte SSD similar to the Beelink here. So what you're really seeing is an upgrade in both the CPU and the RAM, and along with that CPU upgrade, since both of these are effectively using APUs. APU is a term that AMD came up with, but the fact of the matter is that pretty much every CPU on the market today is an APU, except for very specific models, specifically anything from Intel that has the F moniker, and the same with AMD, since AMD seems to copy Intel a lot of the times when it comes to naming scheme, unless they really do something stupid, like, I don't know, calling their newest CPUs something silly like, I don't know, AMD Ryzen AI Max Plus 395, but effectively every CPU is an APU nowadays because everything is a CPU with integrated graphics. But the configurations here are drastically different. Where on the Intel side of things here, we're looking at a 24 execution unit iGPU, which, just as a point of reference, for this generation of APUs before they switched over to using their Xe Arc integrated graphics, the top end of this generation goes all the way up to 96 execution units, and that gives you roughly equivalent performance to something like the AMD Radeon Vega 8 integrated graphics that used to be on the previous generation before they switched over to RDNA. So pretty dated by today's standards, and especially since this is not anywhere near those 96 cores, or execution units as they like to call them. This, on the other hand, is rocking an RDNA 2 based iGPU, and that is a 6-core variant. This was one of those generations where I particularly wasn't too much of a fan of it due to the fact that just how cut down it was in comparison to its bigger brother. Where going up from the 6600H to the 6800H, you went from a 6-core GPU up to 12 cores. And not to mention there was a clock speed bump to go along with that. So a pretty big gulf there, but this pretty comfortably beats out the Vega 8 graphics that was on the last generation before this. So the real question is there $100 worth of value in between these two systems? Are you better off going with something like the P5, or is the Beelink here good enough for 99% of people out there? Well, we're gonna run it through some gaming benchmarks, we're gonna run it through some workloads, and we're gonna see how it handles day-to-day tasks. And it's not gonna be a super scientific test, but really it's just going to be me sitting down using these in some games, using it for day-to-day activities, and we're going to run a few benchmarks just to get some rough numbers here, because I think you might find the results to be pretty interesting. So let's jump right on in. So to start off, I want to talk about the hardware that these systems are specifically using here in terms of the I/O. If we take a look at the front of these, and by the way, both of these are made by the same OEM, so they're going to look very similar to each other. Yes, they're under different brands, but those brands are owned by the same company. So you can see here in the front that we are looking at a pretty similar configuration where we have USB 3 ports in the front, we have a headphone jack, and we have the power button. Pretty standard affair when it comes to the front I/O. In the top, we see that the S13 has no top ventilation at all. It really doesn't need it at all. And here you can see that the P5 does have some top ventilation, though kind of covered up by this plastic here. Not really sure why they did it like this, but I don't think it's too much of a problem really. It's such a low TDP system, and the CPU itself isn't exactly the most demanding thing ever, that this is more than adequate. I've never found it to thermal throttle in my usage, so it's perfectly adequate. Of course, if we take a look at the sides on both of them, that is where you can see the ventilation on both systems, and it's the same on the other side, also ventilation. If we take a look at the bottoms, both of these have the standard AZW easy access to the bottom where you can get in there and upgrade things, though with the P5 it should be mentioned that there is this bottom fan here. This is a good addition because of the fact that one of the main issues that came up from the first generation of mini PCs that were using DDR5 was the fact that a lot of them did not have adequate cooling for the memory. DDR5 is a lot more power hungry than DDR4 was, so it tends to run hotter, and what would end up happening in a lot of those first generation systems is they would start to throttle down the speed of the RAM, and that would end up causing some major issues in a lot of different workloads, especially if you were trying to do anything like gaming. You would see some very consistent issues in the frame times that would overall ruin the experience. So the addition of this here shows that AZW learned the lessons of the rest of the industry here and are properly cooling both the SSD and the memory. So this is a welcome sight, and obviously since this is using DDR4 and it's such a low power system, it doesn't really need that bottom fan at all. Now for the most interesting part, of course, it is the back I/O, and here is where we start to see the P5 really flex, because while on the S13 we do have two HDMI ports, we have a gigabit LAN port, and we have two USB 3.0 slots. On the back of the P5 we have, of course, two HDMI ports. I would have liked one of those to be a display port, but that's perfectly fine because we have two USB-C ports, and yes, those do take power and they also do display out. Of course, we have two non-USB 3.0 slots, so these are just 2.0, but that's perfectly fine. Those work for I/O, especially since we have the USB slots there. And of course, we do have the barrel jack for both of them, and we have the LAN port here, but this is 2.5 gigabit LAN, so it's faster than the LAN port is over here. This is a really great I/O setup, and for $100, that's a pretty major upgrade. The inclusion of USB-C in particular is what I appreciate the most, because you can pretty much use a USB-C dongle like this that will give you more I/O. So here, you know, you can get an extra HDMI port. There is power delivery in that goes all the way up to 100 watts, so you can power this system directly off of that. You of course get an Ethernet port if you ever need more network ports, and of course we get more USB, and we even have SD card readers and audio out if you need another one of those. The best part is that you can use a wide variety of different styles of USB-C docks. There's tons of I/O configuration that you can get out of those things, and they really make a system significantly better. Computers not having USB-C in 2025, especially USB-C that isn't more than just data transfer, is just such a limitation. So it's really nice to see that this is on a system like this that is only $100 more than this. And yes, I know for a system that's $170, an extra $100 can be pretty significant, but the I/O alone really makes it worth it. But that's just the outside of these systems. Let's take a look at actual performance. So I want to get through the gaming benchmarks first, and we're going to start off with the Civilization 6 turn time test. And this is the version that is for the last expansion for this game, so it's more intensive than the base one in the game. But I think it also gives a pretty accurate result versus what happens in the late game, which is where things really really start to matter in terms of turn time. And keep in mind, this is running with the lowest possible graphics settings because I'm trying to give the Mini S13 as good of a chance to run these games as possible. And well, the final result for the Beelink was a turn time of 62 seconds. So over a minute just to have one turn happen in the late game. And that is, of course, versus a turn time of 35 seconds on the BOSGAME P5. So overall, you're pretty much going to save half the amount of time going with the P5 over the Mini S13. And it really shows just in the benchmark here where everything is going by significantly quicker. It literally is at 2 times speed. Of course, these aren't the best results by any means, but a result of 35 seconds is significantly better than over a minute just to have one turn go by. And this is already looking pretty rough considering that this is a title that at this point is a decade old. But I stand by my stance that the best time to buy Civilization 6 is right when Civilization 7 came out, just like the best time to buy Civilization 5 was when Civilization 6 came out. It's a time-honored tradition of civilizations, and it still seems to hold true. I can't wait to pick up Civilization 7 in about a decade from now. Now, the next game that I took a look at after that is Monster Hunter Rise, and I'm running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and when you set the preset too low, it sets the target render resolution to 70%. So since the base resolution that I'm working with here is 1080p, that means we're effectively running this at just slightly above 720p. So the results that I got with the Beelink were pretty surprising. While it's not spectacular results, the fact that we're getting effectively a 30 FPS average with 1% lows that are very close to our average here, where our average is 36 and 1% lows of 29, that's a very consistent experience, and for the most part is pretty playable. Of course, we are talking about 720p here though, but that doesn't really matter because it does give us a playable experience. But it's immediately humiliated by the fact that the P5 is able to run this at 133 FPS average with 1% lows of 114. So we're effectively seeing a 4x in performance from going with the P5 over the Beelink. That's pretty significant, especially considering that this isn't 4 times more expensive. We're talking about a 50% increase in price so that you can get 4 times more performance in this title. That's pretty significant. And what that also means is that you don't have to use the low graphics profile. You can turn things up. You can pretty much play at the average resolution and still get a high refresh rate gaming experience. Meanwhile, on the N150, you're pretty much locked in at these lower graphics settings and you're pretty much just getting a 30 FPS average gaming experience. Still a pretty impressive result for what it is, but it's not beating out the Ryzen 5 6600H. So the next game that I'm taking a look at is called Vampire Hunter. This is an indie title that I have been playing a lot of recently, and it's effectively taking a 3D approach to the Vampire Survivors type genre. It's extremely fun, and it's a perfect example of an indie 3D title, because these types of games tend to not be super optimized just because of the fact that the development team is extremely small. They don't have the resources to fully optimize a game like this to run beautifully on all hardware. And while we're running this at 1080p at the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you can clearly see that there is a distinct difference in terms of how the game plays on both systems. To be clear, it's not an amazing experience on either system, but it's very clear that the S13 Mini is falling apart. The game has an in-game timer, and I can tell you right now that it is not running at real time. The FPS is so low that the in-game time is effectively running at half speed. To get about 6 minutes into the game took 13 minutes in real life, so it's realistically not playable. Now, on the BOSGAME P5, the experience is a lot different. While it's not amazing due to the fact that you're not getting an above 60 FPS average, this is a pretty demanding game because it ends up throwing a lot of enemies at you. Even though the graphics quality of it isn't substantially high, it still plays really well. It's really fun, and the thing that matters the most is that our frame times are as consistent as possible, and it does tend to do that for the most part. I will say though that as you get get into the later game where you're doing runs that can end up being 30+ minutes and you get a lot of enemies thrown at you at once, it really starts to drag things down. So I wouldn't say it's a title that runs perfectly on the P5 either, but it does end up showing a pretty major difference between the two. While it's not the 4x jump in performance that we ended up seeing with Monster Hunter, it's about a 3x jump in performance, really in between 2 and 3 times more performance that we're getting here. Though the results out of that aren't spectacular, because we're talking about 1% lows that went from being in the single digits to now being in the low 20s, and an FPS average that is in the teens going up into the high 30s. But we're going from an experience that is effectively unplayable to something that is passable and reminds me of how it would perform on the Steam Deck. Now, I wanted to move on to a title that is significantly older, and well, here we are with Killing Floor 2, a game that I personally really like that also is about to be 9 years old. And it's still a really fun game to play and still a pretty popular title. And well, here we are running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, but at the full 1080p resolution. It's one of those titles from back in the day when we didn't have every game coming out with FSR to essentially use it as a crutch. And well, here we end up seeing a similar massive increase in performance, where on the Mini S13 we're struggling to even get a 30 FPS average here, and our 1% lows end up being in the teens. Meanwhile, the BOSGAME P5 ends up giving us a really great result here, where our 1% lows, while they do fall below 60, still end up being pretty great for you to have a legitimately fun time playing this game, and our FPS average being at 90 means that the experience is for the most part pretty smooth. It's only really intense effects that ends up causing issues with those 1% lows, specifically if you're using any kind of flame weapons. That can really start to bring things down, and you do have some headroom here to start turning up some graphics. So overall, another one of those results where we see a about 3x performance uplift going with the P5 instead of the S13 Mini. But these are the types of titles that aren't really meant to run on a system that low budget. But one of the most surprising things to me was when I took a look at an indie 2D title. Here we have Hardy Hard, which is an indie title that I have loved for years. This came out all the way back in 2015, and I have come back to replay this so many times. It's one of my absolute favorite games. It's such a simple premise and it's so easy to pick up, and ever since I got into gaming handheld, it's been one of those titles that I really enjoy using. But to my surprise, the results on the Mini S13 have been pretty surprising. For the most part, it's a 60 FPS average, but if you look at those frame time charts, there are some major fluctuations happening there, and the 1% lows also show that. It's really interesting because the experience is drastically different on the 6600H. Where both systems are using very little power right now. I mean, the N150 is using only around 5 to 6 watts, and the P5 is only using 9 watts. But clearly there are some more inconsistencies happening with the N150, where it seems to be struggling on such a basic light title. I don't really understand why it's like that, and it's certainly not the case in every indie title, but this was one of those ones that was a standout to me and was pretty surprising. It doesn't ruin the experience of playing the game. It's one of those titles that you don't need to have a super high FPS or anything like that, and the inconsistencies really aren't super felt in the game, but it is one of those things that's surprising. Okay, so we got through the gaming portion of all of it, and I mean, keep in mind that the Mini S13 is not meant to be a gaming machine, but some of those games were pretty surprising in terms of how well they performed and how poorly they performed. But let's take a look at how these systems perform in day-to-day tasks if you're just using them as normal computers. But first, just to really understand what we're dealing with here, let's take a look at some benchmark numbers. So running Cinebench R23, we can see that the Intel N150 ends up getting a score for the multi-core score of 2,827, as paired with a single-core score of 933. In terms of multi-core score, it ends up scoring just below an Intel i5 6600K running at stock speeds. Though there still is a pretty noticeable gap in there, and that is a 4-core 4-thread CPU from all the way back in August of 2015. So almost 10 years old, and this little system is not matching it in terms of performance, but we are running at a far lower TDP. Of course, if we take a look at the single core score there, we do also see a pretty noticeable gap where the N100 falls pretty noticeably behind that i5 6600K. When we throw in the 6600H, then the gap becomes pretty massive, where the multi-core score of that Ryzen 5 is 8,981. So again, almost a 3x increase in the multi-core score. And if we look at the single-threaded performance, well, that's a score of 1,466, putting it comfortably ahead of both the N150 and the i5 6600K. So there is a very massive difference in terms of CPU performance between these two systems, and we're not talking about a huge jump in terms of TDP. We're effectively looking at about double the TDP for over 3 times more performance. Not a bad result at all in Cinebench R23. Now, if we take a look at Cinebench 2024, here the results are pretty similar. I have far less information on Cinebench 2024 from multiple different chips, so the only thing that I can really compare it to is what I have, and well, the N150 is the lowest scoring chip that I have in that benchmark. The second highest chip that I have tested on there is the Ryzen 5 Pro 2400G, and that ends up having a pretty noticeable lead in the multi-core score in comparison to the N150. Meanwhile, the Ryzen 5 6600H ends up beating out the Apple M1 by getting a multi-core score of 515. So again, a very noticeable and very massive lead. And if we take a look at the single core performance, well, here is where the charts change a bit. Now, instead of being at the bottom of the stack, it is now the third lowest for the N150, where we get a single core score of 60, beating out the 58 that I ended up getting with the Ryzen 5 Pro 2400G. And interestingly enough, beating out the Ryzen Threadripper 1950X all the way back from the original generation of Threadripper. So quite a few years old, but the multi-threaded performance of that is just going to be significantly higher because that is a 16-core 32-thread CPU, but the individual cores themselves are apparently not as powerful as the N150. And this time around, the 6600H ends up falling pretty noticeably behind the Apple M1, where it ends up getting a score of 86. So still a lead over the N150 and a pretty noticeable one, but it definitely is not keeping up with the Apple M1 that ends up scoring 112. But of course, it has more cores and threads than the Apple M1, so that's why the multi-core score was comparable to it. Overall, the results here are pretty great because you go from something that is towards the bottom of the stack to something that is comfortably in the middle for both the single and multi-core performance. And again, we're talking about $100 difference here. But what is it like to just sit down and use these systems? Well, this one's going to be a far more subjective discussion, but I'm just going to tell you what it was like for me to use both of these systems. Both of them are more than usable enough for most day-to-day tasks that the average person is going to be doing. The truth of the matter is that nowadays, most of the things that you do on your computer live in a browser. So whether it means you're going onto Reddit, onto YouTube, onto Twitter, working in Google Docs, or working in Office 365, or rather Microsoft 365, all of that is going to run perfectly fine. Even programs like Discord are going to work more than adequately on here. The real difference comes with the fact that if you're trying to do too much on the N150, it starts to become pretty apparent. See, Windows has become more and more demanding over the years, and especially as Microsoft has decided to add more and more features that seem to be very unnecessary and are only there to extract as much information as they can out of you. And well, all of that is running in the background. And while Microsoft has made some very important efforts that have made Windows a lot more multi-threaded, that ends up causing some issues because if you run Windows Update on the N150, it will push the CPU to 100% utilization. And of course, what that means is that the updates are going to happen as fast as they possibly can, but that also means that if you're watching videos, if you're just using your computer for day-to-day tasks, suddenly anything that you're trying to do is really putting a strain on your CPU because it's already maxed out. So you're going to encounter more issues. And not only that, but the updates are extremely slow because of just how limiting those CPUs are. As an example, before I started doing any of the testing that I was doing with the Mini S13, so even before I made the video on it, I was updating the entire system to the most latest version of Windows. That's what I do with every system that I test, just to make sure that it has as many patches as possible and it is more realistic to what someone that is today buying it is going to really experience. And well, that update process ended up taking 2 hours. It took a ridiculously long time for anything to download and install on there because it was only downloading 2 things. It was the update and some update to the .NET framework. And it took so long that what I ended up doing was I pulled out a Ryzen laptop that I have had sitting on a shelf for about 6 months now. I booted that thing up. It's rocking a Ryzen 3 7320U, a 4-core, 8-thread Zen 2 based APU on a very low budget Lenovo laptop that ended up costing me like $250. Now this thing has not been updated in months. And what I wanted to see is if I could update Windows on that system before the Beelink system even finished. And so I pull it out, I plug it into charge, and I boot it up, and I realized that I had wiped the system because I had intended to sell it. I just never got around to listing it. So it had a fresh installed copy of Windows from months ago. So after running through the setup process and continuing to wait for the Beelink to finish updating, I opened up the Windows update on the Lenovo laptop so that I can run the update process and of course to install some of the drivers because it didn't even have the Wi-Fi drivers installed. I had to use a USB-C dongle to get all of this. So the entire process of essentially troubleshooting this thing, I did all of that, got the system set up, plugged in the Ethernet adapter, and finally started running Windows Update where it was installing all the drivers for the system itself as well as the update to Windows that it needed to be on the most recent version, and it was doing the same .NET framework update that the Beelink was doing. And even though I started doing all of this after already waiting 20 minutes for the Beelink to update, the entire process ended up taking about 30 minutes to update on the Lenovo. And that meant that I still had to wait about another hour for the Beelink to finish. So I had this laptop effectively going from brand new to fully updated and usable before the Beelink even finished updating. And this was with the Beelink doing absolutely nothing else. I wasn't using it to watch videos. I wasn't using it to browse the internet. It was sitting there by itself just updating, and it took that long. That is the issue with only 4 cores and 4 threads, especially if the single core performance is just that far behind even in comparison to an i5 from almost 10 years ago. So look, if you're just trying to use these computers for day-to-day tasks, both of them will be more than adequate, though the Ryzen is going to be faster. Do you really care if your web browser opens up a little bit faster or a video loads a little bit quicker? Chances are you're not really going to notice unless you have these things side by side to each other. But you are going to notice the time that it takes to do something like updating Windows or having all of your CPU cycles used up because a update is running on the background or some service is running on the background. It's a problem when it can start to affect what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, and that's the real benefit of going with something like the P5. You go from having 4 cores, 4 threads to 6 cores, 12 threads, which means that you have effectively more lanes on a highway so more cars can move through. Instead of it just being completely bottlenecked by just those 4 cores, you have so much more headroom. And not to mention the increased gaming performance, you're seeing a multi-generational jump in performance for just an extra $100. And this is the price category where that is the most noticeable. Because if you go from the 6600H up to whatever is in the next tier, something like the 6800H or a 6950H, or even all the way up to a 7840HS or an 8845HS, you're not seeing the multi-generational jump in performance. Your multi-core score is not going to go up 2 or 3x. And your single core performance is not going to change practically at all unless you're looking at going from Zen 3 Plus to Zen 4 or Zen 5. And even then, we're not looking at massive leaps in performance. We're seeing a one generation jump. So if there's any price category where spending an extra $100 makes a massive difference to your experience, it's going from that $100 to $200 price range up to $200 to $300. That is the sweet spot for the vast majority of users. And I understand a lot of you guys might think that, well, all I need is the N150. I'm not really doing too much. And look, if you're going to use this as a computer that you're going to use on a day-to-day basis, I do really think it's worthwhile to spend that extra $100, even if you have to wait another 6 months to save that up. And why would you want to be that CPU limited today? Are you buying this system to just use it for the next year? If you just need a holdover computer like that, then by all means get the N150. Get any mini PC that has the N150 and use that until maybe you save up enough money to buy yourself a full desktop a year from now or 2 years from now, if that's what you want to do. But in the grand scheme of things, is $100 more really that much more that you don't think it's worth it for 3 to 4 times more performance on the CPU and 3 to 4 more times performance on the GPU, and having access to faster storage, faster RAM, and a higher ceiling for your RAM? I don't think you need to throw 96 or 128 gigabytes of RAM onto here, but if you have a workload that would benefit from that, you have the option, and that's not something that you have with the N150. So really think about it, really consider that. I don't want to sound like a shill here, because at the end of the day, if you're happy with your purchase, you're happy, and that's all that really matters. But I want you to think this through, because I don't want you to a year from now start looking at your system with the N150 or N100 or N95 and start thinking, man, if I just had a little bit more headroom, because you can get so much more headroom for an extra $20 here and another $20 there and another $20 there. But I don't want to ramble on about this for too long. I just really want you guys to consider your decisions on how you're going to spend your money here, especially with the current situation in the economy. Be smart with your money. Get the most for your dollar. So let me know what you guys think about this down below. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree? Why do you disagree? Why do you agree? But anyways, I really hope that you guys found this useful. I hope it made you reconsider what your purchase was going to be, or maybe reaffirmed what you wanted to spend your money on. But I'll catch you guys in the next one.